How does rake impact your strategy in poker? Most players don't realize that their strongest opponents are not the other players at the table, but rather the house itself. In today's lecture, I'm going to show you how to minimize how much rake you pay, how to adjust your strategy for different rake structures, and how rake impacts your win rate theoretically and in practice. Hey everyone, before we start the video, would really appreciate it if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you and enjoy the video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to conquer the rake. First and foremost, I'll show you where to find free pre-flop charts for your specific rake structure. We'll cover how rake impacts your strategy as well as your win rate. We'll visualize rake as a utility function, and then I'm going to show you some general post-flop adjustments you can make to improve your play at different rake structures. The first question you should ask yourself is, how can you find the best possible pre-flop charts for your rake structure? Luckily for you, GTO Wizard has just added a ton of different rake structures. You can see we have solutions from chip EV, that's rakeless, all the way down to NL25, which is pretty high rake, and everything in between. To see these solutions, open up the solution selector in the top left corner and select pre-flop only solutions. From here, you can see we have various stack sizes, complexities, and rake structures to suit your needs. You can even study different opening sizes. If you're curious about the rake percentage and cap, select this preview icon. You can see the rake is shown in this panel here. The next question you should ask is, how does rake impact your strategy? To answer this question, we're going to start pre-flop. Now, generally speaking, rake hurts calling ranges, but opening frequencies and raising frequencies stay about the same. Overall, as we increase the rake, we see more folding and less calling, which should be obvious because, well, the rake cuts into your win rate. But let me show you some examples of what I mean. In this chart, we're showing the opening frequency by position from under the gun at the top to small blind at the bottom. Now, you'll notice that the opening frequencies stay about the same. So, for example, under the gun is opening 18% of their range at NL25, and they're opening 19% of their range in chip EV. And so it's very, very close. There's not a huge difference between chip EV and micro-stake solutions here. There are some small changes as we get to the later positions, of course, but only about 2% or so. And so, okay, if opening frequencies don't actually change that much, then what about defense? Well, defense changes a lot, and this is what I mean when I say rake hurts calling ranges. This chart displays big blind strategy versus a 2.5x button open at different rake structures. At the top, we have NL25, which has an 8 big blind cap. At the bottom, we have chip EV. And you can see as it goes from NL25 to NL100, NL500, and chip EV, our overall folding range increases and we're calling less often. Meanwhile, our 3-betting frequencies stay approximately the same in each spot. Let me show you an example. I'm going to select these pre-flop solutions again, and we're going to use a 2x opening size and select chip EV, CEV. So this means, again, rakeless. Here we're looking at under the gun's opening strategy in a rakeless cash game, and we can see that they open about 18.8% of hands. How would their opening strategy change at 25 NL, where there's a lot of rake? 18.2%. And we can see there's really not a big difference between these two strategies. The hand selection changes a bit, but the overall frequency is very similar. Okay, so what happens when under the gun opens and it folds the big blind? Well, here we can see that they're defending about a third of their range at 25 NL, but if there were no rake, they would defend more than half their range. It's a very significant difference. And there are two reasons for this. The first is that rake is generally more leveraged on the player that's closing the action due to the no flop, no drop rule. So when big blind calls, they're guaranteed to get raked, whereas when under the gun opens, they are not guaranteed to get raked because it can fold pre-flop, right? The second reason is that the big blind just has more close decisions, right? Many, many more close decisions. And this means that small changes to the expected value of their hands can have big changes on their overall defending frequencies. Here's another example. So the button opens, action folds the big blind. And we can see, again, that the chip EV solutions, that is to say, the rakeless solutions, will defend much wider compared to these high rake NL25, NL50 solutions. But something else changes. You'll notice that the 3-bet construction becomes much more linear in chip EV and much more polarized at NL25. The reason for this is because it's optimizing for different things. At NL25, it's raising hands that are at the very bottom of your range that have good blockers and want to generate some fold equity. Queen deuce, king deuce, ace x, these are all hands that are kind of crappy calls, but they can generate a lot of folds if you 3-bet them. And indeed, when they do 3-bet, you expect the button to fold quite often, almost 70%. Now compare that to chip EV. In a rakeless game, the button is expected to defend much wider facing a 3-bet. And for that reason, instead of optimizing for fold equity, it's optimizing for hands that do reasonably well when called. Suited connectors, suited broadways, strong pocket pairs, and such. Now, perhaps you're worried that this 3-bet size doesn't work for you. Well, keep in mind you can always try these research solutions, which have many more 3-bet sizes, and so you can see how the button responds to a range of different sizes, again, at various rake structures. All right, we've touched on some pre-flop strategy, and I'll circle back to strategy later in this presentation, but first, I think it's important to show you how rake impacts win rates. So what I've done is I've graphed how much rake you pay at different stakes from GTO against measured hand history data. At the very top of this graph, we see NL500, which has low rake. You expect to pay approximately 3.3 big blinds per 100. At the very bottom of this graph, we have NL10 with high rake, and here you expect to pay about 8 big blinds per 100. The blue lines represent your theoretical rake, or how much a GTO solver thinks you ought to be paying overall, whereas the red line represents how much rake you are actually paying according to measured hand history data. So why is there such a big discrepancy at these lower stakes? It seems like players are paying much more rake than they ought to be paying according to what GTO thinks. And I think the reason for this is that at lower stakes, players are not folding enough. And just in general, there's going to be more recreational players that are putting in too much money, seeing too many flops, and just pumping up the total amount of rake paid by the overall population. Whereas at the higher stakes, there are fewer recreational players, players are a bit stronger, and therefore the theoretical and actual rake get much closer. The next most obvious question, to me anyway, was how do GTO win rates vary by position? How much should each seat win from under the gun through big blind, and how do these vary by stake? So I calculated these win rates from chip EV, NL400, and NL10 from under the gun through big blind. First thing you'll notice is that the later positions pay a larger proportion of the rake on average, and this is simply because they're playing more hands and therefore paying more rake. For example, under the gun, we see that the win rate changes from 11 big blinds per 100 in a rakeless scenario to 8 big blinds per 100 at micro stakes. Whereas on the button, we see that the win rate varies from 25 big blinds per 100 all the way down to 17 big blinds per 100. So there's a lot more variance here. But all of that is dwarfed by how much more the blinds pay. It appears that the blinds end up taking the brunt of the rake, I suppose because they are defended to continue the widest and play the most flops out of all of these positions. The measured rake data from my previous graph was taken from this site, PrimeDope, which has a great free online poker rake calculator. I recommend checking this out. They're not paying me to tell you this, it's just a great little free tool. So, first of all, you can see how much rake you would expect to be paying in big blinds per 100 across different stakes and different formats. At the very bottom here, I particularly like this table, which shows stakes from 10 NL all the way up to 500 NL, and you can view this either as formal rake, net rake, or big blinds per 100. And here you can see that some sites are going to offer way better deals than other sites. So it's important to scope out your competition. Even if you're limited to what sites you can play on, you should scope out at what point you start to get a significant break on the rake in order to plan your bankroll management. We can arm ourselves with knowledge all we want, but to be honest, the most direct way to pay less rake, to pay less money to the house, is just to get a good rake back. And so rake back allows you to reclaim a percentage of the rake paid, typically contingent on putting in a certain amount of volume. Scout good rake back deals online, network with your poker friends, and see what's out there. Don't just take the default amount. Learn to use some of the online tools like what I've just shown you. And importantly, I recommend looking for good deals before you create an account with the casino. You can often get a better deal this way. It should be noted that many casinos will try to obfuscate how much the rakeback is. And sometimes it's hard to measure because it'll be in the form of loot boxes or splash pots or whatever. But in general, you can usually figure out how much rake overall you're paying if you're tracking your hands. It's important to realize that not all players will pay the same amount of rake. Generally speaking, we can categorize how much rake you pay according to 3 factors. 1 is your rakeback deal, 2 is how many flops you see, and 3 is average size of the pot you're involved in. And so players that pay less rake will typically have a better rakeback deal. They'll play fewer flops, which just means folding pre more often, or acting aggressively pre-flop, and they'll play smaller pots on average. That means they're putting less money into the pot overall. Conversely, players that pay more rake might have no or a bad rakeback deal. They'll generally play more flops and just play larger pots on average. So loose aggressive players generally are going to pay a lot more rake than tight nitty players, which is why a lot of the winning regs at microstakes are using kind of nitty strategy. Now, with that said, it's not always dependent on what strategy you're using. If you're playing a GTO strategy against the Maniac, that Maniac can cause you to put in more money than GTO would otherwise, just due to how your strategies interact. And that can lead you to paying more rake overall, just in general. It's also important to realize that exploits against these types of players aren't fully benefiting you. Some of the edge you gain from exploiting a Maniac goes to the house in the form of rake rather than into your pocket. Okay, so we've discussed how rake can impact your win rates, but now I'd like to return to strategy. Let's focus on pre-flop rake versus no flop, no drop. If you play on a site like GG, you get charged pre-flop rake. If you play on most other sites, there is a no flop, no drop rule, meaning you only get raked on pots that see a flop. This creates different incentives to 3-bet or call more pre-flop. For example, if there's no flop, no drop, you have more incentive to try and take it down immediately pre-flop before you get charged rake on that pot. Whereas in GG games, there's typically a little bit less incentive to 3-bet pre-flop. Doesn't mean you should never 3-bet, there's just less incentive because there's no longer that incentive to take it down immediately. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you 2 rake structures. They're both 5% capped at 3 big blinds. One is raked pre, the other is not. And we're going to see how that changes your strategy in GTO Wizard. So here I've selected these pre-flop only research solutions. And the research solutions are kind of useful because they give you a ton of different raise sizes so you can see what size the solver prefers given many options. First, I'm going to select these GG Russian cash solutions. And again, these have a 5% rake to a 3 big blind cap. We're going to compare this to NL100, which also has the same rake structure. The only difference is that at NL100, no flop, no drop rule is in effect, whereas in GG Russian cash, that is not the case. Now, these look pretty similar, but there's one huge difference, and that is 3-bet sizing. So here, NL100, when the no flop, no drop rule is in effect, solver prefers much larger 3-bet sizes, 12, 13, 14 big blinds even. Compare that to GG Russian cash, where the solver prefers smaller raise sizes, 9 big blinds, 10 big blinds, 11 big blinds. And again, the reason for this is that when the no flop, no drop rule is in effect, the solver will absolutely exploit that rule to try and pay less rake. It'll adjust its strategy to something that 3-bets large and often in order to take down the pot pre. That can be difficult to visualize, so I've made this chart to help you visualize it. In blue, we see GG pre-flop rake, and the other one is no flop, no drop. And we can see, again, a very clear preference for the no flop, no drop solutions to 3-bet much larger out of the big blind facing a button open compared to GG rake. And this is just kind of a general trend you'll see in GG solutions. Some of the marginal raises become calls. And the reason is that there's simply less incentive to try and take it down pre through a 3-bet. And so therefore, they'll just call a bit more often as opposed to raise. Whereas with the no flop, no drop rule, the solvers will often prefer very large 3-bet sizings out of position and kind of maneuver their strategy in such a way that it's largely focused on 3-bet or fold strategies facing an open. Next, I'd like to visualize utility theory. Now, utility functions are something that alter the value of chips. So in a cash game, we can talk about rake. In a tournament, you could talk about ICM pressure. These are both examples of utility functions that alter the value of what a chip is worth. In general, rake tends to lower the reward rather than the risk. And so what we could do is we can see how rake percentage and cap changes our utility function by graphing our risk-reward ratio at different stack depths. Let me show you what I mean. In this chart, I've visualized your risk-reward ratio against the size of the pot. So this is the rake utility function. That's this area in green here. Now, you don't have to worry about all of this math on the side. That's just to make the chart interactive. Essentially, the way you read this chart is the horizontal axis represents the size of the pot. The vertical axis represents your risk-reward ratio. For example, here the rake is 5%, and this means that, well, you're in this region, you're going to get about 90 cents on the dollar. Now that may be confusing. Why are you getting 90 cents on the dollar when it's only 5%? It's not 10%. Well, it's because you risk, for example, in this case, 20 big blind pot, you and your opponent each put in 10 big blinds. If you win that pot, your net gain is 9 big blinds. If you lose that pot, your net loss is 10 big blinds. And so you're getting 90 cents on the dollar. And this continues. You keep getting 90 cents on the dollar until you hit the cap. And once you hit the cap, you can start getting a discount when it comes to the risk-reward ratio. But we can see how this changes as we increase or decrease the rake structure. For example, if there was no rake, you'd just get 1-to-1. You get $1 on $1. Chip EV, it's perfectly fair. Now, what happens is we increase that rake percentage. So this is 15%, 10%, 5%, and lower. And we can see that it increases in this nice, smooth, geometric way. Okay, so let's put that down to 10%. Let's see how this changes as we vary the rake cap. Now, this, of course, will change when we start getting that discount. And as we increase the rake cap, it becomes harder and harder to make a pot big enough that starts getting a good discount. So anyway, if you want to try out this graph, I'll link to it in the description. The parameters are P for the percentage of rake paid and C for the rake cap in big blinds as shown in the middle of the graph here. Oh, one thing to mention about this is that in general, rake tends to be front-loaded. And what I mean by that is that generally speaking, you're going to get a better deal in a cash game when more of your stack is invested, as opposed to, down here when you're paying the full amount. However, in, for example, some of the micro stakes places, so for example, this will be your average micro stakes region, you're just going to be paying the full amount either way. All right, that's enough utility theory. Going forward, I'm going to concentrate on how rake affects your strategy and win rate post-flop. Here we see a button versus big blind single raise pot, and I've graphed the rake's EV, the expected value of the house, at NL 500, NL 50, and GG NL 50 as a higher cap. We'll notice something interesting here. First of all, the rake's win rate is kind of absurd. So the house is making 66 big blinds per 100 in this scenario. That's a lot of big blinds, okay? So don't underestimate the rake. Probably a better way to view this, a fairer way, is to graph the pot share rather than the big blinds per 100 because everything looks big when you multiply it by 100. So here we see the big blind's expected value as a percentage of the total pot on the left-hand side. And we can see it's 36% at all three rake structures. On the right-hand side, we see button's expected value, and the rake is red in the middle. And it looks like big blind's EV stays the same, whereas the rake is kind of eating into the button's win rate. And so one way to understand this is that the big blind is actually playing tighter at these high rake structures. And so they're kind of defending in such a way that they'll have exactly enough pot share post-flop. And so in exchange, the button is going to take down more of these pots pre-flop. And so we're not really seeing button's pre-flop EV here. We're only seeing EV when they get called by, for example, a tight range at these high rake structures. Perhaps it'll be clearer with an example. Let me open GTO Wizard and show you how I generate these. So from the solution selector, again, I'm going to select spots that have post-flop included because I'm doing a post-flop analysis. And we'll just look at 100 big blinds, general solutions, comparing different rake structures. All right. So firstly, let me show you how I get these values that I've shown you in the previous chart. We'll go button opens, big blind calls, and I'll just select the flop reports. The flop reports are great because you can see what the overall strategy looks like, but you can also see what players' expected value looks like. For example, here we see big blind's expected value, button's expected value, and we can toggle that between EV and big blinds and as a percentage of the pot using either hotkeys or by changing your settings. Now, let's go over here and take a look at the betting note. So this shows how often the button should be c-betting across all possible flops. And in general, we're going to notice that at NL 500, you're going to be betting a bit wider than, for example, at NL 50. And conversely, you notice that at NL 50, the big blind donks more often than at NL 500. So what's going on here? Well, again, this is just a byfactor of the fact that big blind's range is tighter at NL 50, right? They call fewer hands at NL 50. Their range is therefore stronger when they do call. And therefore, we c-bet less often as the button at NL 50. Conversely, at NL 500, the range is wider, and so we get to c-bet a little bit more often. And we'll notice that, even facing a bet, for example, the overall raising and calling frequencies are very similar. And this is because the solver will adapt how wide and what type of hands it bets to the rake structure to achieve a new equilibrium. You can notice, for example, across all possible flops, we're folding a third of the time versus a third pot bet at NL 50, and a third of the time facing a third pot bet at NL 500. Really doesn't change too much. The only thing that maybe changes a bit is the free betting frequency, and even then, it's very close. I did a similar analysis for under the gun versus big blind single raise pot, and we see all the same things. The big blind's EV is stable across all three, so in all cases, they're getting about 29% of the pot. The rake tends to eat into the under the gun player's EV post-flop, and this is a function of big blind's range getting tighter as you increase the rake. Analyzing the reports in GTO Wizard, we don't see very much of a difference between the aggregate betting strategies at NL 500 compared to NL 50. You'll notice that it's very, very similar, putting in more money at NL 500 as the under the gun player because you're playing against a wider calling range. So same as before, we're going to open up GTO Wizard, and here we're looking at cutoff opens, small blind 3 bets, action back on cutoff. And this is 500 NL. We can see that they're calling a good quarter of the time, or betting maybe 10% of the time, overall defending a pretty decent portion of their range. At NL 50, however, even with the same size, you're folding a lot more often, defending less often, and overall, against this size, you should basically be 4-betting more often than you're calling. And so this means that when cutoff does call, they have a much stronger range in general, which is why we saw the patterns observed earlier chart. Let's take a look at the flop reports. So I'll open this up and take a look at the flops. Here we see that at NL 50, we're checking about 37% of the time and typically preferring a good mix of sizes, anywhere from 20% to 75%. At NL 500, you can see very similar overall distribution in our frequencies, but certainly majors change. The biggest change is in our expected value in terms of total pot share. See that up here as well. So anyway, the main takeaway here is to be cognizant of when you hit your rake cap. As a reminder, you can calculate when you hit the rake cap by taking the cap, in this case it's 4 big blinds, and dividing it by the percentage. 4 divided by 5% is 80 big blinds. So at NL 50, you only hit the rake once the pot exceeds 80 big blinds. But, for example, at NL 500, you'll hit the rake much sooner. So here it's 0.6, that's the cap, divided by the 5% rake. So you hit the rake cap once the pot exceeds 12 big blinds. And so it's important to pay attention to that specific threshold, because that's going to tell you a lot about how a solver wants to maneuver its pre-flop strategy. All right, I think we'll wrap it up here. If you guys have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out in our Discord server. It's a great place to ask theory questions, or just drop a comment on this YouTube video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you got something useful out of it, and I hope you pay less rake. And as always, happy grinding.